Childhood trauma caused by violent video games. By yours truly, Gus Sanchez. Have you ever played a violent video game? Was there a point where the game looked too real, too explicit to be played? Or even who plays these types of video games, like children, adults, or even elderly? For many, playing video games is considered to be a fun way to pass time or escape from reality into a creative world that you can control with no rules. Many would say that video games bring others together and form long-lasting relationships. O'Day states that video games can be a fun hobby to do as they can make you feel like a winner. However, according to an article made by No Bullying, they state that at least 15% of video games have violent and mature content in it. Kids are killing people in video games and getting reward for it. Violent video games can cause children to have violent tendencies. Before we get started, there are some words that need to be defined that are used during this video as well as the topic. The first is quad-A nucleus. Quad-A nucleus is the upper of the two gray nuclei of the corpus luteum in the cerebrum of the brain. The next is mental trauma. Mental trauma is a psychological or emotional disorder that is caused by the damage or injury towards the brain after living through an extremely frightening or distressing event. Another is post-traumatic stress disorder, which is also known as PTSD. It is a condition that develops when a person has difficulty recovering after and experiencing or witnessing a terrifying event causing nightmares, flashbacks, or intrusive vivid memories. Now let's talk about background and history. Violent video games have started to rise since the very first ones were released. Many have considered games like Mortal Kombat being one of the most infamous violent video games ever made, according to Rolling Stone. Since then, there have been many more violent video games within the category. Many new ideas have been released for this genre every single year, so that goes to show how people like the genre and still request it in high demand. Every single year, old violent video games become remastered, and every single year, they get better. There are many genres of violent video games. Some may actually question how violent video games cause so much trauma, especially to children. However, O'Day states, violent video games intended specifically for the child demographic have been made since the late 1990s. When violent video games were introduced, their main intended audience was adults. As the genre grew, many alternative violent video games were made specifically for children. This genre was clean of blood, gore, and sexual content and was considered not as bad as the regular violent video game made for adults. Violent video games can be traumatic. Many people don't really associate with violent video games that have to do with real-life scenarios, as this can cause aggression. Aggression, often associated with violent video games, can be considered an example of past mental trauma. This means that people, most likely pre-adolescents who have already been diagnosed with an existing mental health issue, are more likely to have emotional distress when playing violent video games. To summarize, according to Mark A. Schuster, violent video games have focused on aggression. A few studies showed that kids who played high violent video games on an average of 2 hours a day showed more depressive and aggressive symptoms than those who played low violence games for the same amount of time. Bophy and Schuster argue that a pre-adolescent would already have to have mental health issues in order to be impacted by the gameplay of violent video games. Both articles had the same conclusion, which is that violent video games have shown to cause aggression in children as well as mental trauma. Violent video game studies have shown that cause aggression in children, although that could be because of the amount of time the child has been playing, thus causing him to act out when he or she is not playing. Many talk about violent video games in a different way, depending on who's playing. Pollack states, mature, which is specifically the rating for violent video games and made for only adults. However, research has shown that children find violent video games more enjoyable than any other video game. Basically, pre-adolescents tend to be more interested in violent video games than any other video game genre since they were released. Even though there is a rating on the genre before you play to protect children from being exposed to sensitive content, and alternative video games are made for kids. While violent video games have proven to cause emotional distress, aggression, and PTSD in children, research has shown that the way violent video games are made can actually cause aggression, but there are also studies that argue there is actually no accurate evidence on how violent video games can actually cause mental health issues in children who play violent video games. Pritz states, violent video games do not actually trigger any health problems or violence in kids. However, APA does mention that studies reveal that violent video games can cause aggressive enhancing effects. In conclusion, there are many studies that show how aggression can affect a child's behavior, but there is actually no hard evidence that shows the possible effect of aggression created by the genre. From both article understandings, there are many studies on childhood trauma caused by violent video games. However, in both arguments, there is yet to be shown any true evidence of violent video games causing mental health trauma. To wrap up, violent video games give users a fun, intense gameplay that has to do with real-life scenarios and can include some explicit content that anyone can get their hands on, including children. Although children might find this genre of gaming fun, it's also not appropriate to have them play at a young age. Even though there's no clear or hard evidence of violent video games causing mental health issues, aggression, or drama, it is good to keep in mind that there can still be a possibility it can harm child's way of thinking.